This is the Financial Sense News Hour. Now, here's the Financial Sense News team, Jim Poplava and John Leffler.
Well, the market seems to be euphoric. It is anticipating major stimulus spending coming from the government, tax cuts, and all kinds of other things that will help the economy grow at a faster rate. But could there be problems in implementation? Joining me on the program is A. Gary Shilling. He's editor of A. Gary Shilling's Insight. He's also author of The Age of Deleveraging. Gary, I want to begin our discussion with trade because the president can do a number of things. He can propose, but Congress legislates, and that's certainly what's going to happen, whether it's repealing Obamacare, cutting taxes, or fiscal spending. But let's begin with trade. In your recent Insight, you talk about China. When we look at China, we see that China is moving on a number of fronts. Economically, in their Silk Road project, they are building ports, railroads, dams, pipelines, and industrial corridors across a swath of countries in Asia, Europe, and Africa that is going to expand its economic role. They're also building military bases. But let's begin with China because the president claims that they've been involved in trade war and unfairly treating us when it comes to trade. I'd like to get your thoughts on that and some of the issues that are at front here.
Well, to begin with, all this money that China has to spend on the Silk Road and all the other things you mentioned, Jim, you can see that's courtesy of U.S. consumers because it's really U.S. consumers importing cheap Chinese goods, and no reason they shouldn't. They're much less expensive than buying them domestically made, but that poured tremendous amounts of money into China. China has had a consistent, huge trade surplus. That means that they end up owning a lot of U.S. assets because when they're exporting more than they're importing, they end up at the end of the day with a difference, which adds to their reserves. And their foreign currency reserves were $4 trillion. They've now had to reduce them to accommodate the rush of money trying to get out of China. They're down to actually a little less than $3 trillion. But still, that's a lot of money, and it gives them a tremendous amount of the wherewithal to go out and spend it on anything they want to, buy assets in the U.S. or invest in Asia or whatever. So I'm not blaming the Chinese. I'm just saying if you want to say where did they get the dough, it was basically from U.S. and European consumers as well. But they're the ones that were buying all these products and piling up these assets in the hands of China. Now, China is obviously very interested in moving out internationally. You know, it's interesting. In Shakespeare's, I think it's Henry V, they're having a war with France, and the dying King Henry advises his son Prince Hal. He says, busy, giddy minds with foreign quarrels. In other words, if you got problems at home, go out and start some war or something overseas. And I think that's got something to do with China. Their economic growth is slowing. They no longer have the huge export growth. That's what got them there, but with slow growth in Europe and Japan, we're just not buying as much at a rapid rate of growth as we did earlier from China and other developing countries. So their exports are actually declining. They used to be growing 20, 30%. That game is over. They also, as this slowed, they invested in a lot of infrastructure, and that ended up with ghost cities, excess capacity, and huge debts. So China's growth is definitely slowing, and I think that President Xi, who's running the place and increasingly with an iron hand, is trying to divert attention away from the domestic scene. It's not only these foreign adventures, and of course on top of that, China thinks they're the world's top culture, and they were. You go back, 1,000 years or so before anybody had ever in the West had heard of China, much more developed than they were in the West. But with the Industrial Revolution, which they really refused because they thought they had the best of all possible worlds, they lost out. And in the 19th century, they were dominated by the Europeans. They still are smarting over that. So they're really kind of reasserting their authority. So that's another reason that they're out on these adventures. But it's interesting, just going back to what they're doing, Xi is instituting a really top-down, call it a spy network. It's George Orwell's 1984 Big Brother. Now they have legions of inspectors that are checking into even low-level party members on a regional basis to make sure that they have correct thinking and so on. And obviously, this is what I've dubbed the current Mao dynasty. This Mao dynasty, they read their history and they know that a lot of previous Chinese dynasties got tossed out because of labor unrest, usually because of high unemployment. And so these guys, I think, they're trying to divert attention with this grand international exposure, attention from a slowing domestic economy. They're trying to tighten up their grip domestically. I think it's all part of a grand scheme and really quite understandable and even predictable.
Well, it was amazing because at Davos, President Xi was coming across as a free trader. But Gary, as you allude to in your article, whether it comes from dumping excess steel, aluminum, and other products, stealing Western technology, transfers, limitations on Facebook in terms of China, and also recently a lot of companies have said that China is kind of clamping down on other companies that are operating in the States. So does Trump have actually his facts when he talks about they are engaged in a trade war in many senses?
Oh, yeah. I think we're already in a trade war. Now, of course, in any war, it's the other side that always are the bad guys and we're the good guys, let's face it. And we have our own biases. And there's no question we have a lot of anti-dumping laws and regulations. We have something called the International Trade Commission, which is a U.S. body, but industries can bring charges of anti-dumping against foreigners and steel, for example, and they can get judgments by the U.S. government. They have to be endorsed by the president ultimately, but we're not completely immune from this game. But I think any reasonable person looking at it objectively would say that China has been running very much a mercantilist policy, and that's part of this whole desire to build up their assets, to export, to limit imports, to demand technological transfer of anybody who wants to be in China, to refuse to let our companies into attractive areas there, to reserve them for their national champions or state-owned enterprises. And, of course, it was really almost laughable with, as you mentioned, with Xi at Davos. He says he's a big globalist and Trump is a protectionist, kind of an attempt to sketch a reversal roles when it's really been quite the opposite. But I think here's a very important point, Jim, and one I keep constantly making, and I made it in that article in our monthly newsletter Insight and many, many times elsewhere. But when you're in a situation where you have global surpluses of almost everything, and there's plenty of labor, there's plenty of productive capacity around the world to meet demand today, when you have a situation, who's got the upper hand? It's the buyer, it's not the seller. It's the buyer, and we're the buyer, and China and other developing countries are the sellers. And I think Trump instinctively understands that, as do the Chinese leaders. So they're very much on the defensive here, and this idea we're big globalists and we've got to solve this all together and so on and so forth. I mean, that's almost laughable, but what can you expect? I mean, I wouldn't say they're completely cornered, but they're certainly being pushed that way.
Let's talk about some of the internal conflicts that are going on in China itself. As you pointed out, Gary, their exports have dropped as a percentage of the economy, and they're trying to make this transition from an investment-driven economy to a consumer-driven economy. But if you take a look at offsetting a lot of what has happened as a drop in exports, they've used infrastructure spending, which has created huge excess capacity. As you talked about, there's plenty of labor and capacity, which has given rise to ghost cities and a gigantic debt burden, which has gone from 164% to well over 200% of GDP. And there's this hope that consumer spending will pick up, or let's say carry the torch, from all this infrastructure spending. But China's consumer spending, as you point out in your newsletter, accounted for only 37% of GDP in 2015, and that's the lowest of any G7 country.
Yeah, that's correct. And G7 or BRICS, if you throw in India, Brazil, Russia, I think the lowest is 55%, and China's almost off the map. They have very much emphasized production and building up the government. And again, it's a top-down kind of society, so they can do that. They obviously realize they have to make a transition, but it's a difficult one. First of all, they're starting at a very low level. Secondly, they have institutionally, they have a lot of restraints on this. They're geared up for production, not for consumption in that country. It isn't like this country where basically it's what consumers spend ultimately runs the economy. And if it's electronic gadgets, fine, or health food or junk food or whatever, it's primarily consumer, but it's very different in China. Another interesting point is that China is a Confucian society, And in that society, it's very important, part of the Confucian tenets is that people take care of their families. They provide for their families, and that means they tend to be big savers. They have low incomes, and they save an extraordinarily high amount of that. I mean, we save about 5% of our consumers' after-tax income. In China, it's more like 20 or 25%. And they're saving that to provide for their families and so on. And another thing, they don't have the equivalent of Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid in China or student loans. So people have to save for their kids' education. They have to save for their retirement, for their health care, and so on and so forth. And that also encourages high saving and holds down consumer spending. Now, the Chinese are trying to change that. I think a few years ago, there was a feeling it was going to happen in a couple of years, but it's really probably a decade-long project at minimum.
I want to talk about some of the issues on Chinese growth and also the possibility of a hard landing. They're using figures of economic growth of 6.7%, which is a far cry from the 12, 13, 14% of the last decade. But Gary, as you point out and others, nobody believes those numbers. They're probably about half of that. So they have all these see-through cities where you have all these buildings where they call them ghost cities. How can they prevent an economic bubble from bursting when they're still, they're trying to clamp down on credit extended to the real estate sector? But how do you prevent a bubble from collapsing?
They just basically legislate that it can't collapse. They pump money into failing institutions. I mean, most of the state-owned enterprises which control most of the Japanese production are, in effect, subsidized by the government one way or the other, and they just keep pumping money into them because they're very inefficient, but they employ over half the workforce, so they just keep supporting them one way or the other. It's not unlike, Jim, Japan. You and I can remember the zombie companies in Japan after their real estate and stock collapses in the early 90s. Japan, they didn't have anything like we did where we cleaned up the banks and bailed them out and so on. They kept them on, and they just kept pumping in them. They called them zombie banks because they literally were dead, but nobody admitted it, and everybody just agreed that they weren't. It's the same thing. They just pretend, delay and prey on bad loans. They, in effect, said that they are good. And when you don't have a market economy that forces these things, when you don't have the ability of somebody to go to court and force somebody into bankruptcy and so on, there's no way that these things naturally play out. So, yeah, I think China, if China were a open economy, they probably would be in deep, deep trouble right now. But it's really a very controlled economy, and as long as they have that control, I think they probably can keep it going much further than anybody would expect.